You good?
Really?
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Al, it's a pleasure to have you at Warehouse Liquors today. I've looked forward to this more than I can say. This is some of the favorite parts of the year for me, is an opportunity to be able to hang out with you, especially around whiskey. So I've got a few questions. We're going to try to make this interesting exchange of some of what I know and some of what I don't. I guess I wanted to start off with your background. Tell me, are you from Kentucky originally?
I am a native-born Kentuckian.
Ah, so you've lived there your whole life?
Well, with the exception of a little time we spent working at the Seagram plant in Indiana when we lived in northern Kentucky and in Ohio.
That's sort of a suburb I think of as of Kentucky in its own format.
It really is.
I'm not sure they see it that way. When did you start working for Four Roses?
I started in 1967.
What got you to Four Roses?
My wife. She wasn't at that point.
Was she working with them?
She was a lovely woman. No. She said one day we'd been dating for about a week, and we decided that we wanted to get married. And she said, "Well, you can't work in public relations." And I was actually working for a theater at the time, nationally known Actors Theater now.
Ah.
And I was in their PR department, and so she said, "You've got to find a job that's got some substance to it, something that, that can make some money." So I heard by the grapevine that Seagram's was hiring people, and as long as they were degreed college folks, they didn't care. They would train you to do whatever they needed done, and I thought that's a good place to start. So I went in, and they hired me, and funny thing, I asked them, I said, "Now, you're for sure I've got a job here?" They said, "Oh, yeah, you do. You hired in, and you started work today." And I said, "Well, that's good, because I need a week off next week because I'm getting married and I want to go on honeymoon." And they said, "Sure." Well, what I didn't realize is they were banking future productivity on that marriage angle, that if you were married, you were grounded. You had some kind of reason to want to go through and survive. So they were happy to have somebody that was either married or getting married, because that was stability.
Mm-hmm.
And when we went to work for them, they trained us to do everything we do now.
What was your first job working with them?
I was a setup guy. That means I worked in a quality control lab, and every morning when the noses came in, they expected me to have 60 to 90 samples set up of products, fresh make, products off of the bottling lines, water, steam samples, all of the products from the outlying distilleries around Louisville. That's where I started, actually. And so I would have those set up, and then they would come in, and it was quite a process. Most of them smoked. So before they came into the sensory lab, they had to stop that and wash down with high-proof spirits so that they had some way to identify the aromas and smells organoleptically. So they would come in and they would make a round around the table or two and decide that everything was okay, or if something needed to be improved or something was wrong, they took care of it right there. And then that was transmitted out to the operations department, and they made those changes. So it was where I learned.
It's an interesting cross between science and art, because, it's so subjective, and they're doing it through the filter of nicotine, as it were, but they did what they could to clean that through.
Right.
But it's kind of your filter, and you if you stopped smoking entirely, it probably would have thrown off their whole sensory element to that. You were basically the gopher to be able to get the samples. You didn't choose anything. You were doing what was produced at the time?
I didn't choose anything, no.
But you were watching them work, so you
right,
learned.
And they would let me sit in on these selections and so forth, so that I could differentiate the different plants, the different yeast codes at that time, the different products that they were putting out.
That's a fascinating opportunity to
It
learn
is.
from the very beginning, in that. Where did you go from there? And
Well, I went through every phase of the operation in Louisville, from that position through the control lab, which was more analytical chemistry than just what we've just been through. Went through bottling, went through warehousing, finished goods, distillery, everything all at one time. And then an opportunity presented itself to go out to what's now called Four Roses. Back in the day, it was called Old Prentice. And I worked there for one season. At the end of that season, they decided to shut Louisville down. It was one of their organization moves. And they also gave us out there an opportunity to either stay with the company or go. And my opportunity came to go to Indiana and work there. So I worked there for 7 years in warehousing and the distillery. No,
So
I moved to Delhi, Ohio, outside of Cincinnati. Uprooted the kids who were in high school and middle school. It was pretty bad. But they survived and came out of it being better for it. And then I found out that there was an opening at Four Roses again, or at Old Apprentice. Applied for it and got in because I'd worked there before, and came back and shortly thereafter made distillery manager. And then I ran the distillery for a large number of my years from 1990 up to about 2007. And then in 2007 I got ready to retire. So I went into the president of the company, who was Japanese, and I said, I think I'm going to retire in June. He said, oh, no. He says, I would like to offer you a proposal. And I said, what is it? And he said, well, I'd like you to stay on as brand ambassador for Four Roses Bourbon. He says, you know about the history, you know about the process, you're pretty good talking with people out in public, and you might have good writing skills, so I'd like you to put all of those to work. Go out and represent the brand, and then I would like for you to write the book on Four Roses, which is what I did when I wrote the book, Four Roses, The Return of a Whiskey Legend. So the first book came out in 2010, and right now we're planning on revising it again and printing it.
You kind of came in at such a perfect time. On one hand, the company's always been running, but the renaissance of whiskey started around 2000 or so, and you were actively solid in the middle of this process when this became aware outside of Japan of the quality that Four Roses could produce. Now it's iconic and prestigious to have access to some of the finest liquids out there, but you really brought that forward in a most propitious time to do it. That's got to give you a great deal of pride, feeling that you have a good deal of responsibility for the success of the company.
It does, but there were a lot of other people that were equally caught up in this successful thing, whether they were the master distillers, the sales organization, marketing, whatever. Everybody had this passion to try to make this work. Gene, we started out rebuilding the structure in the United States because we didn't have any. When Seagram's bought the brand in 1943, they started changing the formula and turning it into a blended whiskey for sale in the United States because we were in the middle of World War II. And they thought the war was going to go on forever.
What was it before a blended whiskey?
It was a blend of straights.
Oh, I see.
There's quite a difference. The blended straights is all straight bourbon whiskeys, whereas the blended alcohol could have things in it like neutral grain alcohol, a bit of aged whiskeys, maybe some caramel for color, and some blending sherry to help flavor along. So they were putting the Four Roses blended whiskey out in the United States after they were selling bourbon in Japan and Europe because the war ended abruptly in 1945. And although they bought a terrific company in 1943, they had 20 million gallons of alcohol aging in the warehouses. And now they had an abundance since they were doing blends. Because during World War II, you couldn't make alcohol to drink.
Right.
You had to make it for the war industry. So they had all this bourbon left over, blended whiskey's going very well. That was back in the day when a liquor company could tell you what to drink, and almost when to drink it.
As I recall, it was possible at some point you could give a gift of alcohol and write it off on your taxes.
Exactly.
In that, so that was a particularly rewarding time in the business. But it was interesting. It was sort of the beginnings of the end, as it were, for the bourbon business, as you were selling blends of odd spirits that didn't have the depth of flavor that eventually brought the emergence of vodka in, which was a cleaner version of these things, albeit it took 20 years or so for that to evolve. But it's an interesting consciousness to recognize sort of the beginning of the end and watching that come to full circle.
We know America is sort of fickle when it comes to a lot of things, but we're sitting in your store and looking around at your shelves, you see a lot of iconic labels, and you see a lot of different products of different categories of alcoholic beverages, and that speaks of the public. There are people that got caught up in wine and vodka, gin, wine coolers, scotch, all of these sort of things back in that day. And brown goods, as we know it, bourbon, went to the bottom shelf. And so when it did, we were kind of sitting out there worried about our future. Now, in 1971, we'd had a working relationship with the Kirin Brewery that owns Four Roses today. And they were our importer of the straight bourbon whiskey in Japan at that time. So as time went by, we went to the lower shelf, couldn't get the bourbon because it was going overseas. And then in the year 2000, Kirin purchased us when Seagram's, as owned by the Brofmans, ceased to exist. It was kind of warred over between Diageo and Pernod Ricard and a corporation called the Vivendi Corporation. It was sort of a mishmash that had us a little apprehensive about whether we had jobs or not.
Yeah.
But in 2002, Kirin purchased it. And one of their overriding ideals, if you will, or objectives, was to bring it back into all 50 states of the United States as a bourbon. So we got rid of all the blend we could find. There's probably still one or two out there, bottles in the pockets. But we started bringing straight bourbon whiskey back into the United States in 2002. Started out in Kentucky and then expanded our base. And finally, about 6 years ago, we got into all 50 states. Took a lot of work by a lot of people.
Yeah, but the reputation and just the building of that. I remember, I've been working with liquor since 1970, and Four Roses suffered a fairly poor reputation for not especially well-made product. And then I started to hear, stories about the greatness of Four Roses in the early 2000s. Didn't have access until I made a trip in the early part of 2000s to Kentucky and tried it. And I was hugely impressed and wondered why this wasn't available elsewhere. And gradually over time, it became more and more. And now it's allocated. It's a good problem to have. There seems to be more people than whiskey these days. You can't suddenly make up your mind that you want something to be aged and wave a wand and there it is. But interestingly, so in this process, you've got 2 mash bills and 5 yeast strains.
Yes.
Where does that idea come from?
Well, I think a lot of it evolved out of Seagram's research and development department in Louisville, Kentucky. See, when they bought the brand in 1943, they immediately felt like they had to make changes. So what they did was they changed the mash bills to the 2 that we have today, the 60, 35, and 5, 60 parts corn, 35 parts rye, 5% malt, and then the other one, which is 75, 20, and 5. So they already had a difference going on there that was predictable. And then they had a whole library of yeast strains, all kinds for almost all the products they made. And the 5 that we use today evolved out of that library.
When did that process really take form?
I want to say that the 2 and the 5 probably started when they really realized that they had something going with export in the late 50s, early 60s. And came out with the Four Roses. It was 86 proof then, but now it's 80 proof Four Roses bourbon. It's got all 10 recipes in it. And a recipe is 1 yeast, 1 mash bill. So if you use 1 yeast with both mash bills, you've made 2.
Right.
Hence 10.
So it's interesting groupings of concepts because so much of this in my world is derived through single barrels, which is one of the 10 groups in that realm. And what I found fascinating time and again is And this was an evolution for me as well, because at one point I went through all 10 recipes, decided I had a favorite, and tried doing that for a few years. In the first couple of years, it was great. And then I started getting samples that weren't as great as the original ones that I'd had. And I didn't buy anything and felt that there was something going wrong. Over time, I grew to realize that single barrels are often the product of quality wood, more so than any one element beyond that. Mash bill is very important, and yeast certainly has its place in this, but it seems that most people are driven by the yeast, which to me has the least impact in this process. What would you interpret as the most important part of flavor in an aged whiskey?
Wow, I would have to say that a barrel has a lot to do with that. Maybe 60-65% of the final product's flavor and color and so forth is due to the oak barrel that it resides in for all that time.
What percentage would you give to the mash bill?
Mash bill plays an important part as far as being sweet or spicy. So if we have to be diacritical about it, I would say we have at least 20%.
So that covers a good part. In this odd world, how married are you to the yeast strain in this? Do you have a favorite recipe?
I do.
Is that something that would be, how do I put it, indiscreet to offer?
When you come down to make a barrel selection, I go through the barrels just like you do at the same time you do. But I'll write on the back of a napkin my choices. Mm-hmm. And to be fair to the customer, I have to steel myself against my private preference. I have to come up at some divining point with the whiskey to make sure that it tastes good, smells good, it's got a nice smooth finish on it. So I can't really get caught up in the yeast strains. But as I progress in this world and get older, I like something that's a little spicy. So that would indicate that I like K's, the K yeast with both mash bills.
I see.
And then as soon as I say I like that, then the F code is just kind of reaching out and grabbing me by the shoulder and saying, what about me and the minty and the spearmint quality or a little bit of the menthol complex?
It keeps you guessing, time and again. There's a couple of recipes that I haven't done, so I clearly have preferences. But when I pick barrels these days in modern times, the last thing I look at is what I've picked as recipes. The next thing I look at after that is what I've rejected. And we often share, the last couple few is the ones that we both agreed on, that after 3-4 hours of tasting 60% alcohol, it gets a little tricky to be able to get the last nuances. 8 to 10 passes is a study in patience, but it's always rewarding, into the process. But yeah, I love it. For me, I pick somewhere in the vicinity of 50 barrels a year. And there's nothing more difficult and more rewarding than Four Roses, because it takes more time to watch it evolve. A fundamental difference between the two of us is when I'm picking, I'm doing it with my glasses exposed to air and watching them oxidize, and you keep your glasses covered. I like the process of oxidation. I think it opens up the whiskey and shows the finish more so over a period of an hour or two. Why do you keep yours covered?
I want to approach each sample as you would if you were a consumer. And if you're a thinking person at all when you drink, and I'm not saying everybody doesn't, but when you take that cap off or pull that cork out, the first thing you get is that aroma. And that's very important from the standpoint that it sets you up. And then when you get the taste, that clinches the deal. So it's got to have the aroma and it's got to have the flavor. So I'm trying to hold on to that flavor in the bottle and aroma and just opening it up and sniffing it by keeping that watch glass on top of the glass.
That's sort of why we're sort of opposites in respect to that. I, in turn, am in sales, and so I'm selling the finish. The last impression you have is the one that's going to make you decide whether or not you're going to buy it. So I want to see how the whiskey not tastes, but finishes, because your last impression is the one that's going to help you decide whether or not you will want to keep it. The first impression, whiskey clearly changes over a few days. Quality whiskey with some age will evolve over some time. But your first impressions are very much when it's encased in that. And it's always been my goal to get past that. So we're definitely approaching this from different perspectives.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Oh, well, whatever you like. At the end, people often are subjected to some perspective that they're doing it wrong. It's food. If it tastes good, it is good. If you like ice or you use water, do it. It's supposed to make you happy. And there's no right or wrong way to do that. But follow your own lead.
And that's
your
a very
decision.
important point. It's almost a common agreement among us because we've done it so often together. But I want people to come in for a selection to pick a whiskey that they would like to drink and then drink again. I mean, it's one thing to get that first impression and think, yeah, I'd like to go visit that again. But will you? Will you drink it?
I love the mystery. To me, it's a puzzle, a mystery novel. And when you first try it, you so often after the third, fourth pass, the whiskey starts to go south and it changes on you. The mintiness on the afts were always something that I find to be off-putting. But on occasions, I found some good ones. But you want a rich, full flavor that balances. And that takes time to evolve. And it's an interesting process, seeing how these things change, reveal, whether it's song or symphony, the development and complexity takes some time to evolve, and I love watching it present itself.
Well, that also has a lot to do with that 60% for the wood in the barrel. Because you can take the same recipe and fill several barrels of it, put them on the same tier, in the same warehouse, and on the same level. And we have one-story warehouses, as you know. And you put them on that tier, and they'll all be different.
It's the magic of wood. It's why we talk about single barrels, and time and again, I don't know how many times I've had the same distillate, not the same mash bill, but exactly the same distillate in a different barrel, and bought both for completely different reasons. And I found out afterwards because I don't look at anything until after it's done, and I'm just amazed. But it just shows you the fundamental part of this is the magic of starch. Having really good grain is so important and often overlooked because you obviously want a good barrel, but having really good grain is the fulcrum of your DNA. It's where it all begins.
And we use non-GMO corn. And
it makes a huge difference.
And the rest of our product is made on rye and on malt. And they all adhere to our standards. And they have to be fresh and good and smelling and clean. And it's a daunting task, especially when you put those parameters of non-GMO on them.
Yeah, I've had many examples of the same mash bill, new make, that are so wildly different from each other. And you go, well, it's the same mash bill. It's like, each one of them is a snowflake, and they're all different. And just because you're fond, it's why we have vintages in wine. They all kind of stand out in this respect. Is there one or two individuals in this business that you've come across that had the greatest impression on you?
Oh my goodness, you learn a little bit of something from everybody.
Whether you want to or not.
Yeah, you do. And I'm really lucky to be friends in the industry with some of the more experienced and well-rounded individuals. The Russell family, all of them, Jimmy, Eddie, they have been the model that I like to be when I grow up. They are quiet, unassuming. They don't really exhibit a lot of flash when they go out, but they create a buzz because when they walk in the room, they take the whole room over.
It's true. It's really. I'm especially pleased. I just bought 3 Russells about 2 weeks ago, and I have the great fortune of having Eddie pick my barrel samples. It's particularly amusing for me because I have a palate that's more similar to Jimmy's taste than Eddie's. So Eddie picks things that aren't what he would personally like, but he knows what flavors are. And how often do you get the master distiller to pick your own samples?
Sure.
We have a decent reputation for picking good single barrels, but you're only as good as the samples presented to you.
Exactly.
And Eddie is just phenomenal in his skill set and passion. A fairly quiet fellow who just quietly gets things done and knows what he's doing. It's a real pleasure to be connected to that.
Well, they're
family.
competitors, of course, but we never look at it that way.
I think it's symbiotic, because if you're only good whiskey out there was Four Roses, then you would be able to build a category. So, with the strength of the Russells, Wild Turkey products, of course, the qualities of what Buffalo Trace brings, and so many other companies, I think it's just a really comfortable family of a lot of people with the last name Beam, among other things. But it's a pleasure and an honor to be connected within this realm.
And I knew some Beams as well.
Yeah, no.
And I think the first one I went to work for was Charlie Beam,
Really?
who was the area administrator and so-called master distiller at the time at Four Roses in 1983 and before. Quiet, unassuming guy. Knew what he needed, knew what he wanted.
They were kind of born to that.
Shared with me a little bit, and that was one of those other people that had an impact on my upbringing in the bourbon world, you might say.
It's funny because it's so inclusive. It's just people bringing you in. It's not some sort of we can't have these secrets and that. They want to show you. The people are proud of it. It's their artwork. It's their livelihood. It has such a connection. So let's see here. I guess as an extension to your palate, the 50th anniversary was such a personal project for you. Describe what you had in mind when that was made.
Well, first of all, it was a two-pronged process, you might say. We had to come up with a container to put it in. And so for several months, the head of marketing, Julie Gorham, kept showing me the bottle from 1967 and asking me, did I like the design? How about this bottle? What do you think? And I said, finally, I said, it's okay. And then she said, do you like it? And I said, I really like it. She said, good, that's what we're going to use for your 50th. So we got the bottle out of the way, and then we had to come up with a recipe.
It's an interesting priority.
Well, it was just, the recipe is not easy, but glassware takes a little bit longer.
Ah.
So they really had to know about the glassware. So then Brent called me in one day and he says, give me an idea of what you want and we'll look through the profiles and we'll look through the inventory and see what we can come up with. So I said I wanted something, first of all, that was made while I was in the distillery. Secondly, I want something that exhibits southern profiles. In other words, I want a little, if it's in there, I wanted to find some magnolia, and I wanted to find some oak, southern oak. And I wanted to find some molasses, and I wanted to find maybe some fig, all of these things that were running through my mind at the time. And then maybe just something to really finish it off with, maybe an F yeast. So we set up samples and we all looked at them and got the barrels kind of picked out that we liked. And I was going somewhere. It might have been to come up and visit you here in Chicago. I don't know. But he says, we all selected the same one, meaning he and I. And it's a good thing when you can have your master distiller reach over your shoulder after you say, I like this one, and tell you you like that one too. Because Brent doesn't just agree with people to agree.
I did the same thing picking a single barrel of Lefroy with John Campbell. We had a whole range of different things. We came to our own conclusions, and it turned out that we came to the same conclusion, which is gratifying. But you do it independently, but it's still, when people that you respect come to that conclusion, it validates that it's not just your best guess.
That's right.
But it's a remarkably humbling process because it's always a guess.
So he said, while you're traveling, I want to just do a little tweak. So he did a little tweak, and when we came back, we sit down with the samples again and looked at them and wheeled right around to the one we liked originally. And then I thought, well, let's just kind of look again and see where we are. So we came down another couple of samples, and this time when we did, I picked a sample that had that little bit of ting of mint at the end in the finish that we all admire. We ended up with that, and as you know, we came out with a product that's 107.6 proof, and it had OBSF for 12 years, OBSK for 15 years, OESV for 13, and OBSV for 23. We had never put anything in the bottle that old before. So we got all of the flavors that I was looking for, plus maybe some honey and some cinnamon thrown in for good measure.
It's one of my favorite special editions from Four Roses ever, and we've had some pretty good ones out there over time. So it's exciting. We'll transition a little bit, just to kind of follow through. This is a passion that we both share in life. I love to travel. You're now the brand ambassador, and you travel quite a bit. How often are you traveling these days?
Oh, maybe 2 or 3 times a month for 2 or 3 days at a time. We try to make it count by scheduling all of the events in a certain sector, so you can kind of knock them over 1, 2, 3.
You're still enjoying that?
I do.
Get a chance to meet some people with
Yes.
a lot of different perspectives to that.
Exactly.
You've traveled internationally as well, haven't you?
I do, but that's not for the company.
Oh,
Those are mostly my travels.
I remember you went to an Ironman show.
Well, that's the reason I go. And I'm obviously not an Ironman. But my son, my only son, is an Ironman, and he participates in triathlons. And all we have to find out is all my wife has to find out is what country he's going into, and that's our vacation for that year. So we have been to Hawaii, we have been to Germany, we've been to France, we have been to Copenhagen, Denmark, and all of Denmark, and Norway, and I think we're going to Canada this year.
We're in Canada.
We're going to Montreal and Quebec.
Very good. So one thing that we also share is a passion for history. Do you have a favorite author?
I do have a favorite author, but that's not all inclusive. I like to read just about
everybody. It's like a favorite
everybody.
recipe in its own format, you know.
I'm enamored of David McCullough, and I just recently pre-ordered his newest book, The Pioneers, which should be out the 1st of May to us.
That's exciting.
It is.
I love the book of speeches that he'd written. It was just presented in such a cool order of presentation. One of the most fascinating parts to David McCullough is that he pointed out that every single book he's written has never gone out of publication, which is extraordinary because he's written at least almost 24 books, and that's not typical to a long history of history. Do you have a favorite historical person?
Oh, wow. I would say, judging from the number of books that are in my bookcase, I would probably have to go with Lincoln.
I would have gone with Lincoln and Washington, in his own sense, and Elizabeth Grant would probably follow after
And
that.
I don't think you're wrong in that big 3.
Yeah, no, it's just fascinating because of what they brought. It just, for me, becoming president is such an interesting process to be able to overcome a lot of issues and help a great nation in so many different forms. And coming to it at a particularly important time is critical, and it just makes me proud to be an American. And presidents are the most interesting historical figures I've always enjoyed.
You couldn't pick more diversity in 3 people if you tried. One was fairly well off, with Washington. Lincoln didn't start out that way, and Grant was military. So when you put all of those combinations together, and the personal demons they had to fight, as well as the public at the time that they had to go head and head with, it's amazing they survived.
Not only did they survive, but they thrived in nations calling at different times to be able to do that. I mean, Washington was a surveyor. At some point, Grant turned into a tanner, in this. And Lincoln was a lawyer. Lincoln's process is so remarkable in that he was almost completely self-created in his own format. No real education, didn't even have light or books, and he became a lawyer and learned how to become a successful lawyer after not always having the right reflexes.
Well, these people, too, didn't have the advantage of hiring a PR firm to represent them to begin with. So they had to do it themselves. And all three of those were not in a habit of wanting to do that. I mean, they let their actions speak for them, and they made their decisions, if they were right or wrong, they stuck by them.
And they learned to evolve in their decisions.
That's right.
They were pragmatic enough to realize that their first choice isn't always their best choice.
That's right.
Yeah, no. So at this point, I'd like to thank you for coming. I think that this has been as much fun as I'd hoped it to be. And I'm hoping that this was worthy of some interest to my friends out there. And I wanted to thank Al again for taking the time to visit Warehouse Liquors and explain his life, philosophy, and whiskey with us. Thank you.
You're welcome. Was it what you wanted?
I don't know what
You want to go back and do it again? Do we need to get a chance to rewrite it?
Oh, we'll redo it every time we talk, and so